June 4, 1942. The calm blue waters of the Pacific near Midway Atoll suddenly erupted into chaos. Columns of black smoke clawed at the sky as Japanese sailors scrambled across burning decks. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the WWII, the carrier strike force that had terrorized the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, was under assault. In less than a single day, 4 of its frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would be consumed by fire and consigned to the depths. These were not just warships. They were symbols of Japanese power, floating fortresses that had carried the rising sun into battle from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. At Pearl Harbor only 6 months earlier, their aircraft had plunged the United States into war. Now, at Midway, those same decks buckled under explosions as American dive bombers found their mark. Witnesses later recalled the panic. On Akagi, bombs tore through the flight deck as fueled planes, armed and waiting to launch, erupted in a chain of fire. On Kaga, sailors described the decks as a sea of flame, with men leaping into the ocean to escape the inferno. Within hours, the mightiest carrier force in the world was mortally wounded. For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, the loss was devastating. Each carrier represented years of careful preparation, limited resources, and irreplaceable crews. Japan's shipyards at Kure, Yokosuka, and Nagasaki were already stretched thin. Constructing a single fleet carrier could take 3 to 4 years. With steel supplies dwindling and industrial capacity strained, there was no hope of replacing four capital ships quickly. Yamamoto's worst fear was becoming reality. The balance of naval power was tilting. Yet in the stunned aftermath of Midway, Japanese strategists clung to one belief: that America, too, would take years to recover from losses. After all, the U.S. Navy had lost Yorktown, badly damaged at Coral Sea, and sunk at Midway itself. To Japanese eyes, naval warfare was a slow, grinding contest of attrition. Replacing a carrier was a monumental task. Surely America would falter. But this assumption overlooked the vast difference between the two nations' capabilities. Japan's industrial base was finite, hemmed in by geography and dependent on vulnerable supply lines. The United States, by contrast, had mobilized an entire continent. Even before Pearl Harbor, the Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940 had set in motion the largest naval expansion in history. Across America, shipyards at Newport News, Brooklyn, and the Great Lakes were alive with workers welding, riveting, and laying down hulls on a scale Japan could scarcely imagine. For Japan, the carriers lost at Midway were irreplaceable jewels. For America, they would prove only temporary setbacks. Within months, new Essex-class carriers were sliding down the ways, each one larger, faster, and deadlier than the vessels destroyed at Midway. The shock for Japanese commanders was not only in the battle's outcome, but in what followed. Letters from naval officers spoke of disbelief as intelligence reports revealed that fresh American carriers were already entering the Pacific. One officer later admitted, "We thought we had bought time with our sacrifice." Instead, it was as if America pulled ships from the air itself. The Battle of Midway was more than a tactical victory. It was a revelation, proof that the Pacific War would not be decided by skill alone, but by the relentless power of industry. For Japan, the loss of 4 carriers in June 1942 marked the beginning of a slow, irreversible decline. For the United States, Midway became the crucible that tested its resolve and unveiled its greatest weapon: speed of replacement. The image of burning decks and sinking giants would haunt Japan's admirals, but the true shock was still to come. What they did not yet understand was that America's shipbuilding capacity was about to unleash a torrent of carriers so vast and so rapid that the losses of Midway would soon seem inconsequential. Midway ended with silence, flames dying down on the Pacific horizon and survivors adrift in oil-stained waters. But in the factories of America, the thunder of hammers and the roar of forges had already begun to rewrite the fate of the Pacific. And it was here, in the contrast between destruction and creation, that the war's decisive story would unfold. The wreckage of Midway still smoldered in memory when another, quieter revolution began to unfold, not on the seas, but on the assembly lines of America. For Japan, The loss of 4 fleet carriers meant years of painstaking work in shipyards already stretched beyond their limits. For the United States, it was merely a challenge to be met with steel, sweat, and scale. By the summer of 1942, America had tapped into an industrial machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. The foundations had been laid even before Pearl Harbor. In July 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Two-Ocean Navy Act, authorizing a naval expansion so vast it seemed almost fantastical. 18 aircraft carriers, 7 new battleships, dozens of cruisers, and hundreds of destroyers and submarines. It was a bet that America's industrial might could overwhelm any enemy, no matter how prepared. Across the nation, shipyards roared to life. In Newport News, Virginia, entire neighborhoods vibrated with the pounding of rivet guns. In Brooklyn, sparks from welders lit up the night sky, their glow reflected on the East River. On the Great Lakes, inland shipyards, once devoted to freighters and ferries, were retooled to turn out escort carriers and landing craft. Central to this awakening was the Essex-class program. Conceived in 1940, the Essex-class was designed with mass production in mind, standardized components, modular construction, and streamlined blueprints that allowed multiple yards to build simultaneously. Unlike Japan's Kure or Yokosuka, which could manage only a few carriers at once, America's shipyards became assembly lines, where one hull was launched even as another was being fitted with boilers and a third was armed with 5-inch guns. Industrial giants brought their expertise to bear. Bethlehem Steel churned out armor plate and turrets. Kaiser's shipyards, which had already stunned the world with Liberty ships built in mere weeks, now applied similar techniques to warship construction. One foreman later remarked, "We treated carriers like production jobs, not luxury vessels. The faster we laid the keel, the sooner pilots had a deck to fly from." And it wasn't only men who filled these yards. With millions drafted into the armed forces, women stepped into roles once thought impossible. They became welders, riveters, crane operators, the Rosies whose calloused hands built the decks that would carry Hellcats and Avengers into battle. Newspapers captured their determination, one headline declaring, "She builds ships to sink the rising sun." The scale was staggering. By the end of 1942, American yards had already launched more than a dozen carriers, some fleet-sized, others escort types, while Japan had yet to replace even one of its Midway losses. By 1943, new Essex-class carriers were sliding into the Pacific with names like Essex, Yorktown, and Intrepid, each bristling with anti-aircraft batteries and capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft. Japan's naval intelligence could hardly believe the reports. Officers who had studied American industry before the war warned of its potential, but the reality still defied imagination. A Japanese officer later admitted, "We thought perhaps 1 or 2 carriers might appear in a year. Instead, they came as waves, like wheat rising after rain." The logistical effort behind this surge was as impressive as the ships themselves. Trains carried steel from Pittsburgh, engines from Pratt Whitney, and turbines from General Electric. Raw materials moved seamlessly across thousands of miles, coordinated by Washington's War Production Board. In an era before digital networks, America orchestrated a supply chain of astonishing complexity, binding together hundreds of companies into one war-making engine. For the workers on the ground, the urgency was palpable. Many remembered Midway, the headlines of burning carriers, and the hope that their labor would avenge Pearl Harbor and safeguard loved ones overseas. Each rivet hammered into steel was more than work. It was a contribution to victory. From the ashes of Midway, Japan believed time was on its side. But America's industrial awakening was a racing time itself, turning years of shipbuilding into months and months into weeks. While Japanese yards labored over a single hull, American slipways launched multiple carriers in the same season. And this was only the beginning. For as 1943 dawned, those ships would not remain idle at dockside. They would steam westward, their decks crowded with aircraft, their engines humming with power, ready to shift the balance of the Pacific. The thunder of hammers and the hiss of welding torches echoed across America's shipyards as the Essex-class began to take shape. Conceived in 1941 and pushed forward with wartime urgency, these carriers were unlike anything the world had seen before. Each ship displaced more than 27,000 tons, stretched over 870 feet, and carried close to 100 aircraft. A self-contained floating airfield armed to the teeth with 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 40mm Bofors, and swarms of 20mm Oerlikons. They were not just ships, they were juggernauts, built to project power across oceans. Unlike Japan, which constructed carriers one at a time in limited facilities, the United States approached the Essex program with industrial precision. Blueprints were standardized so that multiple shipyards could build identical hulls simultaneously. Modular construction allowed sections to be prefabricated and then welded together, cutting months off production. While Japan struggled to lay down a single hull, American yards at Newport News, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and beyond worked in parallel, turning shipbuilding into an assembly line. Workers felt the weight of history in every shift. One welder at Brooklyn Navy Yard later recalled, "We weren't just laying steel, we were laying runways for the war." In the roar of furnaces and the shower of sparks, these words captured the spirit of thousands of men and women who built not one or two, but dozens of carriers in rapid succession. The Essex-class entered service at a critical moment. In December 1942, the first ship of the line, USS Essex, CV-9, was commissioned. Within months, sister ships like Yorktown, CV-10, Intrepid, CV-11, and Lexington, CV-16, followed. By mid-1943, the U.S. Navy was receiving a steady flow of new carriers, each one capable of fielding squadrons of Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers. These aircraft not only outclassed many of Japan's fighters and bombers, but could be replaced just as quickly as the ships that carried them. The numbers told the story. By 1945, 24 Essex-class carriers were in active service, the largest single class of fleet carriers ever built. Their speed of construction defied comparison. While Japan might require 2 years to finish a single carrier, American shipyards could deliver several Essex hulls within the same time. In some cases, new ships launched even before earlier ones had completed their shakedown cruises. Combat proved the value of this relentless output. Essex carriers formed the core of the new fast carrier task forces, TF-58 and TF-38, which struck at the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and later the Marianas. Their flight decks launched hundreds of sorties in a single day, overwhelming Japanese defenses. The ship's robust anti-aircraft batteries provided a wall of fire against kamikazes, while their size allowed them to absorb punishment that would have crippled smaller carriers. Japanese naval intelligence watched with growing alarm. Reports filtered in of fresh American carriers appearing month after month, a tide that refused to ebb. One officer later admitted that by 1944, for every ship we thought we had sunk, 2 more seemed to appear in its place. The psychological impact was devastating. Japan had entered the war expecting to dominate with a small but elite carrier force, yet now found itself facing a navy that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. For the Americans who served aboard them, the Essex-class became a second home. Pilots spoke of the steady, reassuring decks from which they launched missions. Deck crews remembered the endless rhythm of fueling, arming, and recovering aircraft. The carriers were not glamorous in design, but they were dependable, and dependability won wars. By the end of 1943, the Essex-class had shifted the balance of naval power. What began as a desperate race to rebuild after Pearl Harbor had turned into an unstoppable tide. And as these floating fortresses fanned out across the Pacific, they carried not only aircraft, but also the weight of America's industrial triumph. A living demonstration that no matter how many ships Japan destroyed, the United States would always have more on the way. By the autumn of 1943, the balance of power in the Pacific had begun to shift unmistakably. The new Essex-class carriers, led by Essex, Yorktown, CV-10, Intrepid, and Lexington, CV-16, steamed westward, forming the backbone of America's renewed naval offensive. Where once the Japanese had dictated the tempo with their Kido Butai, now the United States surged forward with a fleet that seemed to multiply by the month. The first test came in the Gilberts, with the assault on Tarawa in November 1943. From the flight decks of these carriers, squadrons of F-6F Hellcats, TBF Avengers, and SB-2C Helldivers rose in disciplined waves. Their engines thundered across the lagoon, hammering Japanese defenses before Marines stormed the beaches. To the Japanese defenders, the scale of the carrier support was overwhelming. The sky was black with planes, one survivor later recalled. For American commanders, Tarawa demonstrated that the Fast Carrier Task Force was now the spear point of the Pacific campaign. Only months later, in early 1944, the same carriers struck at the Marshall Islands. At Kwajalein and Eniwetok, waves of carrier aircraft shredded airfields, supply dumps, and garrisons. The tempo was relentless. Even as one operation ended, another began. Behind each battle loomed the same reality. The carriers themselves were not isolated marvels, but products of an industrial engine that Japan could not match. The contrast grew clearer as 1944 unfolded. While the Japanese tried desperately to rebuild their shattered air groups, America's Essex carriers launched sortie after sortie, with squadrons replenished almost overnight. The U.S. Navy introduced coordinated, fast carrier task forces, designated TF-58 and TF-38, which could mass a dozen carriers at once, striking targets across thousands of miles. From the Marshalls to the Marianas, contrails scarred the sky as wave after wave of American planes swept forward. For Japan, the turning point came in June 1944 at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy committed its remaining carrier force in a desperate bid to halt the U.S. advance toward the Marianas. On June 19th, the largest carrier battle in history erupted. Japanese carriers launched more than 350 aircraft that morning, but the outcome was catastrophic. American Hellcats, vectored by superior radar and guided by disciplined tactics, cut them down in droves. It was like shooting training targets, one U.S. pilot later admitted grimly. By the day's end, more than 600 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, many along with their irreplaceable veteran pilots. The engagement would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American losses were minimal, a testament not only to the skill of their aviators, but also to the industrial system that ensured every plane lost could be replaced within weeks. For Japan, each downed pilot represented a wound that would never heal. Post-war recollections from Japanese sailors captured the despair. One officer wrote, "We fought bravely, but against an enemy that grew stronger each day. Our sacrifice was like drops of water falling into the ocean." The recognition was painful. The enemy they faced was not merely the ships before them, but the factories behind them, the endless production lines that kept delivering new carriers, new aircraft, and new men. By late 1944, the once feared Kido Butai was a memory. America's carrier force, now composed of nearly 24 Essex-class hulls supplemented by light and escort carriers, dominated the Pacific. From the Carolines to the Philippines, every island assault unfolded under the shadow of American carriers. Their flight decks had become engines of destruction, their very presence a symbol that the initiative had passed permanently to the Allies. The carrier comeback of 1943 to 44 was not a single battle but a rolling tide, one that swept inexorably across the Pacific. Japan's naval supremacy, secured in 1941 at Pearl Harbor, had been undone not just by strategy, but by sheer output. The Essex-class carriers were more than ships of war. They were the embodiment of America's ability to recover, rebuild, and return stronger than before. And yet, this was not the end. The next chapter would see the Essex fleet tested again, as kamikazes turned the skies into firestorms and Japan gambled everything on desperate tactics to stop the tide. As the thunder of carrier battles rolled across the Pacific, another war raged silently behind the lines, a war of factories, furnaces, and shipyards. It was here, far from the roar of aircraft engines and the crack of naval guns, that the fate of the Pacific was truly decided. In Japan, the aftermath of Midway left the Imperial Navy reeling. For fleet carriers were gone, but the greater tragedy was that they could not be replaced. The Kure and Yokosuka shipyards strained under the weight of demand, while Mitsubishi's Nagasaki yard, once a powerhouse, now struggled against shortages of steel and fuel. Japanese shipwrights worked with skill, but their hands were tied by limited resources. Even as plans were laid for replacements like the carrier Taiho or the Unra class, Each keel laid was a gamble against time and scarcity. By contrast, across the Pacific, America's shipyards became engines of relentless output. At Norfolk, Puget Sound, and Newport News, the clang of steel and the hiss of welders echoed day and night. Floodlights turned midnight into daylight as shifts rolled on without pause. Liberty ships slid down the ways in mere weeks, each carrying the promise of supplies, fuel, and men across vast oceans. Victory ships followed, faster and stronger, ensuring that American forces would never want for logistics. The statistics revealed a chasm no battle could bridge. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced over 96,000 aircraft carriers, escorts, and auxiliaries combined with merchant shipping, while Japan completed only a fraction of that number. In 1943 alone, American industry turned out 65,000 aircraft and dozens of new carriers. Japan, crippled by bombing raids and material shortages, could not even replace the aircraft destroyed over the Solomon Islands. Workers on the home front understood their role. One riveter at the Norfolk Navy Yard later recalled, "We knew every plate we hammered was another chance for our boys to come home. The ships we built were their shield." Women, too, filled the yards, welding seams and operating cranes. Their presence became a symbol of America's total mobilization, a nation united in production. For Japan, bottlenecks grew insurmountable. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies were strangled by American submarines. Steel supplies dwindled as Allied bombers targeted foundries and rail lines. Even when carriers like Shinano, converted from a battleship hull, emerged from dock, they did so too late and too few to change the war's tide. To Japanese commanders, the scale of America's output seemed almost supernatural. Reports of multiple Essex-class carriers entering service each month sounded like exaggerations until the ships appeared in combat, their decks alive with aircraft. One officer later reflected, "We thought America built ships as we did, one at a time. Instead, they built fleets as if from a mold." The comparison was stark. While Japanese yards labored for years to produce a single warship, America's assembly line methods turned shipbuilding into mass production. Bethlehem Steel, Kaiser's West Coast yards, and the Great Lakes facilities linked by rail created a seamless network of output. Resources flowed in, and warships rolled out, a rhythm Japan could never match. By late 1944, the imbalance was undeniable. American task forces sailed with more carriers than Japan had left afloat. Supply convoys arrived on schedule, guarded by destroyer escorts built faster than U-boats could sink them. Japanese sailors at sea could only watch as wave after wave of American carriers appeared on the horizon, a visible reminder that the real war had already been lost, not on the waters of the Pacific, but in the factories of Detroit, the mills of Pittsburgh, and the shipyards from San Francisco to Brooklyn. The war at sea had become a war of steel, and America's furnaces burned hotter, longer, and without interruption. From that crucible came the fleets that rolled back the rising sun, proving that in modern war, industry was the ultimate weapon. By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific had become an American ocean. What began as a desperate struggle at Midway and Guadalcanal had transformed into a tidal wave of steel and firepower, sweeping relentlessly toward Japan's doorstep. At the heart of this tide was the carrier force, now swollen with Essex-class giants and light carriers whose numbers defied comprehension. The decisive test came in October at Leyte Gulf. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval engagement in history, spanning 4 separate clashes across the Philippine Sea. From the Sibuyan Sea to Surigao Strait, American carriers dictated the tempo. Decks bristling with aircraft unleashed wave after wave of strikes, hammering Japanese battleships, cruisers, and carriers. The proud Musashi, one of Japan's massive Yamato-class battleships, was sent to the bottom after being struck by more than a dozen torpedoes and bombs delivered from swarms of carrier planes. Contrails scarred the sky above the archipelago, marking the steady destruction of the Imperial Navy. Japan committed nearly all that remained of its fleet, including the decoy carrier force under Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa. Yet the deception revealed Japan's weakness more than its strength. The decoy carriers, stripped of trained pilots, sailed virtually empty. When American aviators realized this, the outcome was never in doubt. By the end of the battle, Japan's naval aviation had been annihilated. Its remaining capital ships were scattered, crippled, or sunk. One Japanese officer later admitted in his diary, "We had no answer. The enemy had ships beyond counting. Every day, more appeared on the horizon." From that moment forward, Japanese commanders knew the Imperial Navy no longer existed as a coherent fighting force. America's carriers, by contrast, grew more numerous by the month. Even as Leyte Gulf raged, new Essex-class hulls slid down the ways at Newport News and Brooklyn. Where Japan saw finality, America saw momentum. The campaigns that followed underscored the scale of this imbalance. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, carrier task forces launched thousands of sorties, softening defenses before the Marines stormed ashore. Pilots flew from the decks of the Enterprise, Essex, Hornet, and dozens more, saturating the skies in a manner Japan could not hope to replicate. By Okinawa in April, carriers blanketed the invasion with continuous air cover, blunting kamikaze attacks even as losses mounted. The sheer depth of American reserves meant that squadrons destroyed one day were replaced almost instantly by fresh planes from newly arrived carriers. For Japanese sailors, the psychological toll was immense. Reports filtered back to Tokyo of task forces boasting more carriers in a single operation than Japan had possessed at Pearl Harbor. One surviving commander reflected bitterly, "Each carrier we sank, two more took its place." It was as if America's shipyards gave birth to fleets overnight. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific was no longer contested. American carriers prowled off Japan's own shores, launching strikes against the home islands. The industrial miracle that had begun with the Two-Ocean Navy Act and surged with the Essex-class juggernaut had now reached its climax. Japan's proud navy, once the terror of the Pacific, lay in ruins, broken not only by American firepower but by the realization that industrial might had rendered resistance futile. The Battle of Leyte Gulf and the invasions that followed marked the final blow. From then on, Japan fought only in desperation. Its commanders resigned to a war they could not win. The carriers, symbols of America's shipbuilding triumph, had proven not only decisive in battle but inexhaustible in number. The empire built on rising sun had been eclipsed by a flood of steel, forged in American factories and carried across an ocean to deliver the war's closing chapters. The Pacific War had begun with Japan's carriers striking Pearl Harbor. It ended with American carriers dominating every horizon. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific told its own story in silent graveyards of steel. The once proud carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, rested at the bottom of the ocean alongside countless cruisers, destroyers, and battleships. The Kido Butai, which had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor, had vanished entirely. In its place, the seas were now dominated by the long, flat silhouettes of American carriers, dozens of Essex-class giants, flanked by Independence-class light carriers and escort carriers built in such numbers that they seemed inexhaustible. The United States had achieved what Japanese planners had once dismissed as impossible: industrial mastery on a continental scale. By war's end, America had produced more than 100 carriers of various types, 50,000 aircraft in a single year, and thousands of support vessels to sustain them. The shipyards at Newport News, Brooklyn, and Puget Sound had worked around the clock, their workers, men and women alike, forging the backbone of a fleet that could lose a carrier in battle and replace it before the enemy could even celebrate its sinking. One Japanese officer later admitted, "It was not their bravery that defeated us. It was their factories." The Essex-class carriers in particular became living monuments to this transformation. First commissioned in 1942, they carried nearly 100 aircraft apiece and bristled with anti-aircraft firepower. More importantly, they kept coming. By 1945, 24 of the class had entered service, more than the total number of fleet carriers Japan had ever possessed. They were not merely weapons of war. They were symbols of a new kind of naval dominance, one rooted in logistics, mass production, and the unyielding momentum of an industrial society mobilized for total war. For Japan, the lesson was brutal and undeniable. Midway had seemed, in 1942, a stunning reversal, for frontline carriers gone in a matter of hours. But Japan still believed that victory might come through superior training, bold tactics, or sheer sacrifice. By 1945, those illusions had collapsed. The empire had discovered the unforgiving math of modern war. Bravery could not outlast assembly lines. Oil shortages, steel rationing, and relentless bombing raids paralyzed Japan's yards, while American factories hummed with an energy that never ceased. Each day of the conflict widened the gap until it became an abyss. And yet, there was an irony in this ending. The Pacific War, launched with the thunder of Japanese carrier planes over Pearl Harbor, ended in the roar of American carrier planes over Tokyo Bay. The weapon Japan had perfected, the fast carrier strike force, had been adopted, improved, and multiplied by its enemy until it became unstoppable. In August 1945, as Japan prepared to surrender, American carriers ringed the home islands, their decks crowded with aircraft ready to strike again if called upon. The legacy of this industrial tsunami extended beyond the war itself. The Essex-class carriers would remain in service for decades, fighting again in Korea and Vietnam, and serving as floating ambassadors of American power during the Cold War. They were more than steel hulls. They were enduring reminders of a nation's ability to mobilize, innovate, and project power across oceans. For Japan, the wrecks at Midway and Leyte Gulf became markers of a hard truth. The empire had underestimated not just America's will, but its capacity to build. The Pacific was not lost in a single battle, but in thousands of factories, where welders, riveters, and machinists ensured that ships sailed faster than the enemy could sink them. And so the story closed where it had begun, at Midway. In 1942, Japan had believed it had crippled America's future at sea. By 1945, it was clear America's future had been built not on the decks of a few carriers, but in the unyielding strength of its industrial heartland. The thunder that once echoed from Japanese carriers at Pearl Harbor now belonged to the endless fleets America could conjure from steel and sweat. The Pacific War had been decided not just in the clash of fleets, but in the factories that fed them. And in that contest, the outcome had been inevitable.